All right, go for it.
All right, so this is Angel. How many of you guys know him? A few of you, okay. So he's a new professor here, newish. We hired him last year. He came from Notre Dame, where he got his PhD in English and a graduate minor in gender studies. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a graduate.
Neither did I until I enrolled.
And he came, as I said, last fall, hired primarily for his expertise in young adult fiction and youth culture. Angel's work explores how queer experiences, histories, and emotions are shaped and made into stories in LGBTQ literature. He's been published all over the place in journals such as the Allen Review, Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, and in book collections such as Gendered Identities, Critical Rereadings of Gender in Children's and Young Adult Literature, and Lessons in Disability, essays on teaching with young adult literature. He's now finishing up his first monograph on young adult literature and is just wrapped up the co-edited collection you're putting together? Is that
Yes,
finished now?
it's almost finished, yeah.
And what's the title of that one?
Yours, Mine, and Ours, Intersectional Spaces on Screen.
Dynamite.
Published by Duke University Press next year.
That's right, next year at Duke University Press. So we're really lucky to have him here at SDSU and here in the library right now. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you everyone for showing up. This is way more people than I was expecting for this event. Before I begin, I would like to thank Linda Salem for inviting me to speak today and for curating this collection of queer young adult literature and young adult literature on the side, which you could peruse at your own leisure after my talk is done. And I would also like to thank the National Center for the Study of Children's and Young Adult Literature for all of the assistance that they put in organizing this pop-up talk as well. Today I'm briefly just going to provide a quick contextual and historical overview that meshes pretty effectively with my work. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I'm just going to open the floor to any questions or issues that you would like to raise. And I would be more than glad to address any questions that are burning in your mind at the time. Okay. Optimism and hope are usually approached as integral components of the young adult novel's narrative dimensions. Nonetheless, how these components are channeled and implemented in these texts that focus on queer thought and experience varies immensely. On one hand, we have a strand of queer young adult literature that fosters hope and positive emotions in a naive and earnest fashion, often ignoring the ways in which the realities of the world contradict the promises and expectations of these hopes and aspirations. On the other hand, we have a strand of queer young adult literature that recognizes the realities of the contemporary world and how these realities are connected to both cultural and historical struggles. But in spite of this focus on the dangers of our world, these texts nonetheless advocate for the importance of collectivity and generativity as an alternative for thinking optimistically in a broken world. This is in direct contrast to early queer young adult literature, which often rejected a potential for positive emotions to thrive and presented queerness as antithetical to notions such as happiness and futurity. The queer young adult genre emerged in 1969, which was coincidentally the same year that the Stonewall riots took place in New York. The first young adult novel with queer content was John Donovan's I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip. And although the riots themselves did not pave the way for the novel to be published, both the riots and the publication of Donovan's novel are symptomatic of the tensions and pressures encountered by the emerging LGBTQ+ community at the time. The novel focuses on 13-year-old Davy, who befriends another boy named Altschuler during his transition to a new school in New York City. During the later stages of this novel, Davy and Altschuler not only kiss, but also engage in a potentially sexual act that the boys are unwilling to explicitly articulate. Towards the novel's conclusion, Davy's dog dies when he admits to his parents that he made out with Altschuler, leading him to link the dog's death to his own emerging queerness. And I quote, Is that why it happened? Yes, God, yes. It is my fault because of everything I did. It wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for me. It is too my fault. All that messing around, nothing would have happened to my dog if I hadn't been messing around with Altschuler. It's my fault. Mine. As can be expected, both Davy and Altschuler agree to never act upon their queerness again, and they agree that they need to, quote, respect each other. Davy's disavowal of his queerness is quite melodramatic, but it nonetheless exemplifies the disjuncture that existed between queerness and adolescence in the young adult novel. Donovan's novel was just the first in a very strenuous tradition of queer characters paying a consequence for admitting or confessing their queerness to another person. In this respect, the emergence of the queer young adult novel was very similar to the body of queer literature written for adults that was present during this time, in that the negative affect, death, and depression were deeply ingrained in the genre. Part of this has to do with, as Michael Cart and Christine Jenkins have argued, with the fact that homosexuality was viewed by many at the time as a social problem, which led these characters to become a fixture in this subgenre of the problem novel, a genre that oftentimes robbed queer people of individuality and perpetuated stereotypes. Cart and Jenkins then show that in addition to Donovan's novel, other works such as Isabel Holland's The Man Without a Face, which was originally published in 1972, while ostensibly well-intentioned and reflective of the social attitudes of their time, equated queerness with disfigurement, despair, and death, thus leading to a reinforcement of some of the stereotypical thinking about queerness that became a fixture of LGBTQ literature. Thus, while optimistic narratives were available for heterosexual characters, the same could not be argued of young adult novels with queer characters. After all, queer characters often faced obstacles that were not surmountable and at times not survivable. These characters were anything but invincible during the emergence of the queer young adult novel, and oftentimes the death of a queer character was implemented as a way of testing a heterosexual character's resolve and sense of invincibility, in that a queer character's death often challenged the straight teen's ability to withstand pain and to overcome obstacles. It is here that we witness the greatest connection that exists between queer literature written for adult and young adult audiences, in that unhappiness, as Sarah Ahmed argues, became a political gift, in that it, quote, provided a means through which queer fiction could be published. This is particularly true when taken into consideration that happiness was antithetical to characters present in queer literature published during the mid-20th century, for publishers believed that through the creation of a happy queer character, a work would either promote the social value of queer life, or even worse, attempt to influence readers to become queer. Bum, bum, bum. The negative affect present in queer young adult narratives remained relatively stable until the publication of Nancy Garden's critically acclaimed novel Annie on My Mind in 1982, which became one of the few lesbian novels at the time to not only portray queer identity in a positive light, but that also ends in an optimistic note, suggesting that the two lesbian young adults depicted in the novel would and could end up together in spite of the odds against them. Cart and Jenkins have noted that some of the aspects of the novel have not aged well, particularly when it comes to the contrived fashion in which adults discover the main character's queerness, and the presence of one-dimensional characters tinged with melodrama. However, they contend that the integrity of the main character's relationship made the book one of the few enduring classics of LGBTQ literature. Annie on My Mind was also published during a time in which the problem novel was the most widely published genre of young adult literature. And the novel's content fits with the trends of this genre in many ways, especially since queerness is presented as the problem that has to be dealt with. The field of queer young adult literature began to shift when Alex Sanchez published his young adult novel, Rainbow Boys, in 2001, a text that has been critically and popularly celebrated for its positive representation of three gay teenagers. As Thomas Crisp notes in his critique of Sanchez's work, few young adult novels with queer content have received the type and quantity of critical, scholarly, and popular acclaim and commercial success that Rainbow Boys has. And consequently, the novel has become as close to a canonical work of LGBTQ young adult literature as any other book. Crisp acknowledges the influence of Rainbow Boys in shifting the representation of queerness in the young adult genre, especially when it comes to offering a representation that will, quote, help people to believe in themselves when those in society are telling them that what they feel is wrong. Thus demonstrating that the novel essentially reconfigured the way in which affect frames queer experience in young adult literature. While Rainbow Boys was indeed groundbreaking in many aspects, Crisp critiques the novel's popularity, claiming that despite the novel's achievements, it offers a progressive and assimilationist perspective on gay life by constructing its characters through the implementation of heteronormative frameworks. It reinforces binary thinking through the representation of gay men as either masculine or feminine, underpinning heteronormative and stereotypical constructions of gender identity. Thus, it was only possible to inject a queer narrative with positive affect and optimism by using a heteronormative framework when constructing gay relationships in a novel. Queer young adult novels present us with queer worlds, but as readers, we have to interrogate the stakes and parameters of these constructed worlds and the ways in which they could either foster or hinder queer representation, and the extent to which these narratives can actually nourish queer readerships. In his exploration of genre in young adult queer fiction, Crisp argues that authors are the creators of worlds they ask their readers to accept and trust. Every reality constructed in young adult literature relies on ideological assumptions about how the world looks and operates. The worlds crafted by these authors are both threatening and confirming. They are pleasurable in that they portray queer adolescents in ostensibly happy and comforting situations, but they are threatening in that this happiness is reliant on the perpetuation of binary, hierarchical, and normative modes of thinking, the very processes that led characters in earlier queer narratives to lead doomed, isolated, and impossible lives. While we must admit that some queer young adult novels implement optimism in what Lauren Bernard would call a cruel fashion, approaching the genre solely through this interpretive lens is limiting. While positive affect and optimism can sometimes serve as a false promise, or sometimes it could be contingent on an aspiration that is harmful in the long run, perhaps it is worth thinking through the ways in which the optimism and positive affect present in queer young adult novels can lead one to approach queerness in a more generative fashion. While on one hand, some queer young adult novels use positive affect in a deceiving manner, in that optimism conceals damaging heteronormative foundations, I've been increasingly interested in more recent queer young adult literature that implements positive emotions by focusing on ideas such as generative thinking, identity, and transhistorical connectivity. I've become more and more convinced that we have to imagine alternative, non-normative, more collective possibilities for being in the world. And even more so, I view positive affect and emotions as avenues for examining how queer young adult novels visualize or imagine a sense of futurity that past generations were simply unable to feel. In order to achieve this, queer young adult literature has to either use positive affect as a way of framing readers' approach to the past and the future, and/or it has to identify the ways in which positive emotions allow one to identify alternative means of kinship and of connecting with other people. Thus, I argue that the narrative relationship between affect and temporality will be key in determining the ways in which contemporary queer young adult novels achieve this framing and visualization. Some novels are narratively designed to use positive affect as a way of pushing readers to visualize optimistic and more generative ways of approaching the world. Most notably, David Levithan's 2003 novel, Boy Meets Boy, marked a radical shift in the queer young adult genre, not only because it was one of the first novels to depict queerness as a utopic possibility, but also because it was able to subvert some heteronormative ways of thinking, even though the novel, as Chris has suggested, still adheres to heteronormative values such as monogamy and constructs queerness as something different and therefore in relationship to some norm. The novel takes place in a fictional town in New Jersey set in the future, where queerness, bisexuality, and transgender identities are able to thrive. For instance, Paul, the novel's protagonist, comes out to his best friend in second grade. One of the novel's most memorable characters, Infinite Darlene, is the high school quarterback and homecoming queen, who is introduced as a 6'4" football player scuttling through the halls in high heels, a red shock wig, and more than passable makeup. The novel thus deviates from realism in order to envision a future that is hopeful and optimistic. But unlike the positive affect and optimism found in other works, this positivity and optimism is not too reliant on heteronormative affective structures. As Corinne Vickens argues in her assessment of how queer young adult literature challenges normative assumptions, Boy Meets Boy blurs genre and experiments with language in a way that allows it to undermine, quote, heteronormative assumptions by presenting the unthinkable. Children as sexual beings, hegemonic masculinity as in fact non-hegemonic and detrimental to success, and queerness as normalized and even ordinary. William P. Banks has pointed out that while many readers enjoy the narrative voice and attitude of Boy Meets Boy, they also find the utopia represented in this text to be unrealistic and too far removed from the current circumstances of queerness. He argues, however, that the point of the novel is not to portray queerness in a realistic fashion, but rather to create a critical pedagogy for re-envisioning the options before us. Even more so, Levithan deliberately wanted to contravene the trend of negative affect commonly found in queer young adult literature, and that's incredibly important to keep in mind. Levithan is widely known for his optimistic and utopic treatment of queer adolescence in most of his works. In a reflection of the impact of Boy Meets Boy in the field 10 years after its original publication, Levithan notes that he was disheartened, but not surprised when he found out that people thought that, quote, it was a radical notion to have a happy romantic comedy about two boys. His aesthetic works strive to demonstrate that, quote, tragedy and miserableism aren't prerequisites for a gay adolescence. Notably, Levithan's work deliberately tries to uncouple the relationship that exists between queer narratives and loss through the potentialities of fiction itself. Quote, if you want to rewrite the way things are, the first thing you have to do is write. While many people approach the hopeful and optimistic view of young adult literature as moralizing or unrealistic, optimistic authors such as Levithan contend this view, stating that quote-unquote genuine young adult narrative necessitates some degree of hope. And I quote, that's life, isn't it? Shit hits the fan, the abyss opens up, but then you get through it. You wrestle it down, you find a way to survive. Young adult literature only reflects that. It's not about being preachy or pragmatic to say that most people find a way out of the maze of adolescence. It's only being accurate. Young adult novels are not known for embracing the happily ever after attitude typically found in children's literature. However, the tensions and problems found in young adult fiction are almost always portrayed as survivable and perhaps resolvable. Crisp, however, through the implementation of an antisocial queer theoretical framework focused on the failure of language, questions the ability for future-oriented narratives to offer an optimistic narrative that is not cruel. And he states, texts that seek to imagine a brighter future or better world ultimately feed the normative social order as well. To the extent that a better world is the reward for future generations, a dichotomous heterosexual not distinction remains central in these futures. The problem, however, with implementing a purview such as this is that it implements what E. Kosofsky-Sedgwick would call a paranoid practice or a paranoid reading that refutes the possibility of recognizing the potential for positivity and optimism, one that could lead one to a more nuanced understanding of how queer young adult literature operates. And this is precisely why I am so invested, especially in more contemporary forms of queer young adult literature, precisely because I detect them doing this. They enable forms of reading that immensely depart from these paranoid forms of interpretation. And that is due not only to the evolution of the genre over time, but also a greater investment in exploring notions such as collectivity and intergenerational connections. And just to give you a sample of how that works, we could take novels such as They Both Die at the End, written by Adam Silvera. This is a novel that I have explored before in class, but this is a queer young adult novel that takes place within a future in which people receive a phone call 24 hours before they're about to die. Because of the urgency that these teens experience, it deeply reconfigures how these teenagers think about the present, think about the future, think about how much time they have left. In a sense, this novel allows you to explore how these queer teenagers feel while also pressuring normative perspectives towards time. We also have other novels, and I'm sorry I don't have my copy here right now, but a good example that comes to mind would be David Levithan's more recent novel, Two Boys Kissing, which focuses on the experiences of 7 queer and transgender teenagers. But interestingly enough, David Levithan makes the choice to narrate these stories through the perspective of men who died of AIDS in the 1980s. So you're thus being offered a contemporary take on queer life that is nonetheless filtered through the weight of historicity, through the weight of the AIDS epidemic. We are starting to think about current queer generations as ones that are deeply connected to a past, who are deeply connected to history. And I see queer young adult literature as fundamental in creating these intergenerational connections, in trying to create a sense of futurity for queer young adult readers that is nonetheless mindful of the fact that we live in a time where cultural damage continues to haunt us, where history continues to be a burden. And therefore, this is where I see a lot of the political and cultural potentiality of queer young adult literature. Thank you so much. I'm also sorry I'm sweating so much. I recently am recovering from a fever, and the heat is not helping us well. So.
It is hot, yeah.
Yeah.